And then I kind of decided to kind of move away from just programming, because I really programmed around a lot of issues around, women in film, the women movements becoming more intersectional, not just being about white feminism. Further down, I did events around, lots of events around indigenous film.
And in Colombia, we are trying to accelerate progress. We are trying, and you have been all these days sharing with people from Pro Imágenes, from the industry, from emerging filmmakers, from ethnic communities, and so on. And I wanted just, if you have would like to emphasize some points for systemic change here in Colombia, what would you emphasize in your reflections these days?
In the industry, we wanted the industry to be more inclusive. We wanted them to be more aware. We wanted them to shift their consciousness, be more self-critical. So there's a lot of a lot of workshops.
Buenas tardes.
Applause.
Sí.
Thank you.
Buenas tardes a todos. Muchas gracias por estar acá. Esta conversación va a ser en inglés, so I will switch to English, but I know, yo sé que todos tienen también los que requieren sus equipos de traducción. So, Themba, welcome to Colombia.
Thank you.
Welcome to Colombia, and I would like to start this conversation very quickly because I feel that we have so much to share with the audience, and I would like to have some time for questions. So, your journey has been a fascinating one, and I really admire your transatlantic roots. No? Your parents are from Zimbabwe and Jamaica. You were born in Manchester, in the UK. You spent many years in France, and you consider Berlin your home right now. And not just that, but in your work during 15 years, you have been working with different collectives, filmmakers from the Caribbean, from the continent, from so many geographies. So for me, that's a very important part of your journey. And now you are here in Colombia. So welcome, and first of all, how are you today? How are you feeling in this?
I'm feeling good. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. It's been a long time that I've wanted to come to Colombia. I'm really happy that there's a good turnout today. I've been working a lot with a lot of Colombian professionals, projects. I had a really great pitch event today at BAM Étnico, with also some beautiful projects from all parts of Colombia, from San Andrés, from the Caribbean coast, and Cartagena. From elsewhere, so I feel it's a really rewarding experience being here.
Okay, we are talking about meaning, equity, and moving images. And Colombia has been in your journey, not just these days that you have been here, but also for several years. You host many Colombians and many emerging filmmakers in Berlinale. So I'm curious about that, no? That's the power of films that build kind of a sense of a place without being there. So I would like to ask you about the images that you had from Colombia before in all these years, and the images that you have seen in these days, and maybe what is your reflection about that?
Yeah, I mean, there's a discrepancy in kind of my involvement with Colombia. On the one hand, I have, in my work at the EFM, so I used to be in charge of diversity inclusion at the European Film Market. I created programs which gave access to the industry via the European Film Market. So I created a program called the Market Badge Inclusion Initiative, where we gave market badges to people from marginalized groups, mainly professionals. I also created a program called the Toolbox Program for producers from marginalized groups and from the Global South. And in that context, I worked a lot with Colombia, so I've seen a lot of kind of projects, filmmakers, some of them I've met here, Afro-Colombians, indigenous Colombians. So I see a lot of projects also today in the BAM Étnico pitch space. I saw a lot of projects, so that's kind of, I see those like projects in development happening. But on the other hand, when it comes to going to a lot of international film festivals, which I do, I used to work for the EFM, which is part of the Berlinale. I go to sometimes Cannes, I go to Toronto quite often. And this applies not just for Colombia, but for like large parts of Latin America, I would say, is that the films that I'm seeing that are circulating in international festivals are not necessarily representative or reflective of the ethno-racial dynamic of Latin America, right? I see a lot of films by privileged white males. I mean, this is not just for Colombia, but in general from Latin America. But less films from women, less films from people of color. So there is this discrepancy. I'm happy to see that there are some projects breaking out there. There was a project today which I discovered, which was at Hot Docs, a beautiful project. I've also worked with the Indigenous Cinema Alliance as well. We had Akababuru, which is a short feature by a filmmaker who's Embera from Colombia also. So there are those films breaking out there, but in general, the face which is being given of Colombia at international film festivals is not necessarily representative. And I think that's, it's due to a lot of structural deficits, it's due to a lot of lack of resources, it's due to the fact that filmmakers from equity-seeking and sovereignty-seeking groups require more resources, require more funding. Again, like in Latin America, many of the people who've been able to access cinema and make images are the most privileged, right? So the film industry is an industry of privilege. So how do we overcome that privilege and make sure that other people have access to the resources?
And the images. I mean, you were in Cartagena.
Yes.
I mean, you have been walking around and making time to see Colombia in different spaces. If maybe we can dream about watching a film or other images of Colombia in the world, what kind of other films would you like to see?
I mean, today I'm as you said, I'm Caribbean, I'm Jamaican and Zimbabwean. I'm born in the UK, but that's my background. And so yeah, I spent 3 days in Cartagena, and I didn't want to leave because it was like being back in the Caribbean. The countryside was very much like the Jamaican countryside, and I work in a pan-Caribbean film organization called Third Horizon. So we work with films from across the Caribbean, but we don't see that often, you people from the Caribbean, you're our cousins, and we want to have you in our film festivals, but we don't see that often films from the Caribbean coast in Colombia, and also from the Pacific, you're also our cousins, so we would also like to see kind of much more of those films circulating in festivals like Third Horizon Film Festival or in other festivals. I would love to see kind of much more inclusion and involvement of Afro-Colombian and indigenous Colombian films. I feel like quite often in terms of the diaspora conversations, and this is something that you and I have talked about, and that I'm also trying to kind of bridge the gap, that quite often those diaspora conversations which are happening, quite now there's a huge conversation happening between Brazil and the African continent. There are all of these kind of connections and collaborations going on. To a certain extent, the Caribbean is a little bit left out of those things, but is coming slowly. But even more left out of those conversations, I feel, is Colombia. And so I think there's definitely a need to, I mean, I see that Afro-Colombians are connecting with Afro-Brazilians more, but in that global conversation with Africa, I feel it's, Afro-Colombians are being left out, and I think that many people in the African continent don't even know that there are many Afro-Colombians, to be honest.
And one of the largest diasporas in the world.
Exactly.
1.5 billion people in the world.
Absolutely.
That is an opportunity as well for audiences. Yep. So now, talking about equity, when we talk about equity, we are talking about systems, no? How the audiovisual system works, why some people are left out or left behind.
Yeah.
And you have been addressing that any time I start counting the years that we have been working on that, because I feel it's important, the trajectory and the different spaces where you have been trying to address these inequalities. You have worked in film sales, you have worked in the European film market, you have founded and be part of many think tanks in different regions. You decided now very intentionally to be building the infrastructure in from diversity
Right.
of perspectives and devoting your time, not just, so in your career, for me, it's fascinating that you have been inside the industry, that you have been in market, that you have been in think tanks, that you have also as a consultant and founder of different organizations globally. So I would like to ask you about your experience addressing inequalities, your reflections, your conceptual frameworks, and because I found that that's very, very important for the audience to know.
Yeah, I mean, I'll break it down biographically, I guess. So as I mentioned, yeah, I mean, I never really know where to start in these conversations where you're going biographically, but I'll start with the fact that, yeah, I studied film. I studied the languages, first of all, and then studied film and discovered that there was a profession called being a sales agent, and that it was useful to speak languages if you're a sales agent. So then I managed to get into being a sales agent by doing an internship. And then this was in Paris, and then I realized that I was one of the few BIPOC people. Like at that point in time, there were like 5 black people working in international film sales across the world. It's gotten a lot better. It's a lot more diverse now, but at that time it was a very white industry. And I was going to a lot of film festivals and film markets. So I was going to the Berlinale, I was going to Cannes, sometimes going to Toronto as well, going to the film festivals and kind of seeing what's going on in terms of the films which are being shown and the conversations which are taking place. But I was also being exposed to international distributors. And those distributors used to say like things like, and this is before Moonlight, right? They used to say things like, black films don't sell. If you have a film with all black people, it will never sell. Like that can't, it's a non-starter. Or films with queer people, you know, that will be difficult. Films with all women cast, that will be difficult. People aren't interested in women's stories. So distributors used to say all of these very racist, sexist, homophobic things, and kind of, yeah, so that kind of really made me think around kind of my position in the industry, and also kind of, yeah, looking at how it was very white. The sales industry is white. So I decided to then take that to the Berlinale, to the European film market. That was the market that I was kind of working most with, going quite often every year. And I was like, so how can I create a conversation around inclusion, which is not just around kind of the first black actress, the first indigenous actor, the first one, because that was the conversation around 10, 15 years ago, right? It was always, you know, and that was very boring because that doesn't speak to what's going on in the industry. So I was like, we need to have an industry conversation about DEI, inclusion, having more, you know, different types of people. So I made a concept, and that concept became my former job. I was there for 7 years. And that job was basically in 3 stages. So the first stage was to really, I mean, we've both said we've done lots of curation of panels and podcasts and all of these kinds of things that I was doing at the beginning. And it was very much about, at the beginning, this was kind of in 2017, 2018, it was around making the business case for like diverse films, like do diverse films travel? And then I did all of these panels with like reports which proved that like, you know, films with black cast, films with mixed cast, they travel, they excel. And then I kind of decided to kind of move away from just programming, because I really programmed around a lot of issues around, you know, women in film, the women movements becoming more intersectional, not just being about white feminism. Further down, I did you know, events around, lots of events around indigenous film. I did events around disability. So I did a kind of a lot of awareness raising. And then I decided to kind of say, it's not just about kind of talking the talk, it's also about walking the walk. So how can I create pathways into the industry for people from marginalized groups? So that's why I decided to create the Toolbox program, because we can only structurally change the industry if we open the doors and allow more people who look like us into the industry. And so I created specifically a program for producers from marginalized groups and from the Global South. When I first started, I was bombarded with questions because everyone like heard that, there's this black guy working at the EFM and he used to work in sales, so I got all of these questions. And then I thought, okay, instead of trying to answer all of these questions, then I'm going to create a program. And so that's what I did. I created this program with workshops, with mentorship, with guidance. A delegation comes to the EFM. I created another program called the Market Badge Inclusion Initiative that I mentioned. So all of these programs were designed to make not just the EFM a less white, a less male, a more queer space, but also to structurally change the industry and provide access to resources, provide access to meetings, provide access to people as well. So that was kind of the second stage. And then the third stage was, changing decision makers. I think, you can make the industry as diverse as possible, but if you don't change the people at the top, or if you don't shift their mindset, then nothing will change. I could create as many toolboxes or let as many of you all into the industry as possible, but if the decision makers don't shift, or if they don't become more diverse, then that has a limitation, because you can all, for example, a producer can write an excellent script and it's about, a certain community in Cartagena, and it comes up against a decision maker who's like, oh, what's a palenque? And I'm not interested in that. And so, if I'm me as a black person who's a decision maker, I will jump onto that opportunity, but because I have a connection with it. And so, in these structures, it's also a question of changing the decision makers and of shifting their consciousness, making them more aware of their biases, making them aware that they need to bring in more perspectives, different perspectives from their own, because that's what's been happening in the industry. There's been a lot of gatekeeping and a lot of barriers because the decision makers, by and large, are from the dominant groups and don't let anyone else in. And so that's how I kind of shifted onto this kind of structural approach of organizing think tanks where I'd bring together advocacy groups and decision makers, and then trying to kind of speak to decision makers or challenge the way that they think. One format which I did was called Framing of Us. This was a format where filmmakers from the Global South would talk about their experiences with Global North, predominantly white institutions like funders. And they would kind of, express all of the difficult things which had happened to them, people telling them to change their scripts. And it was kind of very much in the spirit of, again, kind of having decision makers realize the problematic behaviors that they're having.
And I have a question on this regard, because you and me were chatting about that the other day, the exhaustion of having to explain, to teach people, when the other people they have no need to explain anything, but you need to explain yourself. And that's very tiring, but it's one of the points, and it's one of the elements that you are mentioning. So I wanted to leave that there, because I feel that also all these years doing that, to a major extent, there is a level of exhaustion that I felt in the reflections that we have previously. And in Colombia, we are trying to accelerate progress. We are trying, and you have been all these days sharing with people from Pro Imágenes, from the industry, from emerging filmmakers, from ethnic communities, and so on. And I wanted just, if you have would like to emphasize some points for systemic change here in Colombia, what would you emphasize in your reflections these days?
I would say create more funding streams. I know there are funding streams which exist already in Colombia, but there's always a need for more. Create more resources. I like the phrase of that certain people are historically marginalized. Black people are historically marginalized, indigenous people are historically marginalized, women as well. And so in terms of equity, when you talk about that, it's about bridging the gaps, right? So it means that we as black people, because we were enslaved, because of colonialism, we have had less access to resources, so less access to the film industry, so you have to balance that out. So what public policies exist in Colombia to do that. And I know that you're doing a lot of that work, you know, and it's amazing the work that you do in terms of bridging those equity gaps in literature and technology and so forth. So there needs to be much more of that as well. I would also say that at every level of the industry, or it's you know, and this applies for all countries in the world, if you're trying to be more equitable and more diverse, then you have to do that at all levels of the industry and not just create equity positions, right? So it's not just a case of creating funding for people from equity-seeking groups, but it's a case of ensuring that they are across your organization and not just, you know, in the position which is to do with inclusion, but that you have a marketing manager who's also from a like marginalized group, or you have somebody else who's, you know, an accountant. Like, just have everyone be diverse as possible, and that also kind of, yeah, it's actually good for business. McKinsey did reports, has done like several reports for the past like 15, 20 years, where it's proven that organizations which are more diverse across the world function better, like they actually have a higher output. So it's like an also business case to do this. So I mean, I would say that's one of the things to do, and then I can use a few examples of kind of elsewhere. Canada has like an indigenous screen office and a black screen office, and these offices are federally mandated to fund indigenous and black film, and I think like a lot of other countries could have a similar model, or at least have departments. I think, again, like it's not a case of just having those particular agencies, but also like in Canada you have Telefilm Canada and Canada Media Fund, that those other more broader agencies should also be trying to include those voices as well. So there are lots of things you can do in terms of diversifying the staff, diversifying the decision-making processes as well. Yeah.
And part of your experiences being in market, we haven't talked about industries.
Yeah.
No? I mean, it's not just the public sector or the film funds, but also the industry. How are you seeing that from the private sector?
In terms of diversification, or?
Yeah, or more equity from the private sector.
Yeah, I mean, I think the private sector has, certainly the majors have realized that, you know, I mean, if you think that the majors, the majors of studios in America are, not to make this too US focused, but they do have a kind of impact across the world, right? So they are looking at the demographics of America, which are changing, and they realize that there's certain things that they can't do anymore. They realize there are certain things which are not acceptable. If you think of even kind of animation, Moana, and then there was another one which was like with a snow princess somewhere, they've actually worked with indigenous communities to create these animated features, because they realize that if they don't, there'll be a backlash. So they do realize kind of the societal change. They realize that, you know, when I was growing up, it was usual for us to have to identify with characters who are all white in films, or we just did, right? Because we didn't see ourselves represented. But now they realize they can't do that, and so, you know, there is this business case around representation as well. Yeah. Okay.
And in this phase of your career, you have really built this framework that I would like you to share with our audience.
Yeah.
This presentation and this framework that I think shows all that with the conceptual, with the measures, with the agenda also that you have been promoting.
So that's the Equity Inclusion Pathway Seminar, and I brought some slides. So I mentioned that like the work that I did at the EFM was very much in 3 stages. So at one time I was kind of like, okay, how do we really effect structural change in the film industry? And came to the observation that you can't really do that without onboarding the decision makers. And then 2020 happened with, you know, George Floyd, Black Lives Matter movement, and then European decision makers suddenly discovered that structural racism is a thing, and that they were also accountable, that the film industry had also been accountable. So they started asking me and many people questions, and there were all of these kind of working groups around racism with a lot of, you know, dominant white folks who would say, you know, I've never really thought about racism, and they didn't know, you know, the different terms, and again, kind of as you say, there's this thing of being tired of having to explain, even though you do a lot of kind of awareness building. And, at some point, with these European decision makers, there was just this way of like, you're not talking the same language because you mention intersectionality, and they're like, what are you talking about? Or, say black women have an intersectional identity, and they have no idea what you're talking about. So it was kind of bridging that gap. So 2020 happened. I actually shared my office with an Afro-German colleague. He's of Ethiopian descent, and so we decided kind of what are we going to do to create change, and he had done all of these kind of change-making processes. So we created this seminar, we created a vision, we were like, what is our vision of the European film industry? We want a European film industry where there's no structural discrimination. We want a European industry which regulates itself, where you don't have to necessarily have DEI people doing it, that like the organizations know that you need a certain kind of, you need to reflect your society, you need to be safe spaces, all of these things. So we had this vision, which you can see here. And then we kind of looked at the background of kind of, again, what was going on. This is around 2020, 2021, so there was kind of just these 2 years of kind of lots of people, scrambling, and how do I deal with racism? I'm accountable, it's my fault. And so we decided we have to onboard these decision makers. There's a lot of other advocacy groups like Manos Visibles who've been doing amazing work in terms of women in film, queer people in film, racialized people in film. They have a lot of expertise. So the level was different, right? You have these amazing advocacy groups, and then you had the decision makers like this. So we were like, okay, we need to bring them together like this so that they can speak to one another. So that's what we did in terms of the tool, in terms of the Equity Inclusion Pathway seminar. We wanted to really bridge the gaps. And it was also kind of a change-making process that we wanted it to be long-term and sustainable. This kind of, is an overview of the situation back then. So again, the idea was like managing change, looking at the opportunities, looking at the risk. There was a lot of fear involved, right? A lot of these decision makers were super fearful. So we had to kind of hold their hand, do awareness building, but the end vision was to create something where, we create structural change in the European film industry. And so, we decided to create this seminar called the Equity Inclusion Pathway Seminar over 3 years. Again, its mission and aim was to bring together these two target groups. We wanted to shift the level, so we wanted to have these decision makers really understand all the different facets around equity. Many of them didn't know what equity means, because when you said equity to them, they thought you were talking about financial equity. So we were like, no, we're talking about this type of equity. So we had to do education. We wanted to remove biases in the industry. We wanted the industry to be more inclusive. We wanted them to be more aware. We wanted them to shift their consciousness, be more self-critical. So there was a lot of a lot of workshops. And so over the 3 years, and this was at the European Film Market, we held a seminar in 2023, in 2024, and in 2025. Each seminar brought together, was like a whole day of events. It brought together decision makers, it brought together the advocacy groups. They really kind of discussed various aspects of equity and inclusion. It was focused on racial equity, but from an intersectional perspective, because you can't separate the fact that you're a woman and you're black. So we wanted to also include that kind of all of the different facets of somebody's identity. So we dealt with gender, disability, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic background, we included it all in there. And so the idea was to build up the level of these decision makers and ensure that the decision makers could work together with the advocacy groups as well. We kind of voted a political agenda at the first one, and we collected a lot of kind of different aims from different advocacy groups. So we sent them a form. They filled out the form. It would be like if we would send to Manos Visibles, what's your aim in terms of the industry? What would you like to see happen? What's your goal? And so we had these kind of resolutions which were voted on collected and then voted on. And we collected roughly 30 resolutions. In the first seminar, we voted on them and had 5 main resolutions. And then we decided to change the name of the resolutions and called them Sustainable Equity Goals. And this was being inspired from the UN Sustainable Development Goals, because we said that these are more kind of aims and objectives which can be used and adapted to different contexts, and so they're not as fixed as resolutions. And so, yeah, we use these sustainable equity goals as very much as the building blocks of knowledge of what we were doing. So just to make this more concrete, because I know that's a little bit abstract, these are the 5 main sustainable equity goals. So the creation of a Europe-wide equity data collection mechanism, right? So there's a lot of talk in equity and inclusion work around collecting data. How many people are accessing certain funds? How many people are managing to break into certain professions? So that was something that we wanted to do as on a European level. The other one was, again, like this is one which is also relevant for here. So the creation of specific funding streams, like the one that you manage, for Black, global majority, Roma, and other equity-seeking groups. So the need in Europe for having more funding streams for marginalized folks, and so on and so forth. So we collected all of these different goals. One of them was about inclusion riders. So when you go and if you go and you have a shoot in a certain location, your shoot should look demographically like that location. And in terms of kind of making this structural, we wanted to use different partners. So we had what we called ambassadors. These were organizations or advocacy groups or institutions who would then use this knowledge and take that knowledge to their own kind of sphere of influence and spread the knowledge across Europe as well. And then we had partners we funded. So that was kind of Faye's and ours contribution to making the European industry more.
And thank you for sharing that, because that's the infrastructure, that's the agenda, that's the pathway, the systemic perspective, bringing different partners. Because to a major extent, so many times when you are working, building meaning and working for equity, it's like more abstract, symbolic. Yeah. And this is an agenda saying, okay, we are sharing spaces, resources, we have actions, we have measures.
Absolutely.
It's a medium, long term.
Yeah.
So I really thank you for sharing this part. And we are running out of time, and I want the audience to have, but I would like to make 5 minutes for audience questions. And just the last question, because I feel that this is a moment of an existential crisis. I feel that all over the world, where we are all seeing pushback and backlash coming from everywhere. And even these conversations that we all thought that were just kind of natural and normal, and can be seen like even a threat for many people. And and even being human and respect for the other and value difference can be really, I think globally we are facing a very complex moment. Yeah. And filmmaking, for me, is a little bit about dreaming. And as one leader that I really admire said, dreaming is a form of planning. So I want to close this conversation talking about your dream. What is your dream? Doing all this work, moving in so many directions, no? And this deep reflection. I would like to close with that, with your dream.
Yeah, my dream is working beyond equity in a way. I think, this word equity is something that we have to do in a certain paradigm, and I'm so glad that you are able not to devote all your time to equity and write books.
Thank you.
Right? No, it's true, because this is the thing. This is also why I've moved away from it, because it can just suck you in, because you're so.
Yeah, it's the only thing that people can talk to you about. That's all your life. Right. It's like a prison.
It's like a prison, and you can't be creative. And so I think it's important to break out of this paradigm and to break out of this prison. There's two quotes that I wanted to use. So one of them is Toni Morrison's quote that the function of racism is distraction. So if we are breaking out of equity in this paradigm of having to do all of these, I mean, the work was rewarding with the Equity Inclusion Pathway seminar and all of these things, but it's very tiring, and it's also about kind of a constant paradigm that you're trying to educate people. It's exhausting. You're trying to get people to change their ways when, I could use that energy for you and I to be working more, or to be working more with, I'm working now, I've moved away from that, and I work now more with, I said afterwards that I'm not working for any predominantly white organizations anymore, and that I want to work with only Black and Indigenous people and other people of color, so that's what I'm doing. I work for the Indigenous Cinema Alliance, I work for Further Horizon Film Festival, I work a lot with Africa. So again, I think it's about breaking out of this paradigm of constantly trying to fix something which is broken. White supremacy is something which is broken. Patriarchy is broken. It will take a while to die, but we should start kind of doing other things and not be distracted by that racism. And the other quote is Audre Lorde's famous quote on the Master's House. And I think so much about equity is this idea of getting a seat at the table or a foot in the door, and I want to also move away from that logic. And it's not, if Brazil works with Africa, it's not about having a seat at the table. It's like two equals working together. If the Caribbean is working more with India, it's about two equals working together. So I'm interested in these transnational, trans-diasporic connections which are happening now. I think for me that's the future. South-South collaborations, diasporic collaborations, that's the dream. And I urge you to all kind of embrace that and be courageous and try and connect with as many countries around the world as possible that looks like you. There are so many similarities that haven't been explored. And what we're seeing now also in terms of kind of the aesthetics for film is, these connections are creating beautiful films as well. So that would be my dream.
Bueno, Themba habla muy bien español, pero quería esta conversación en inglés. Entonces, por favor, aplaudámoslo. Gracias, Themba, por estar acá con nosotros. Qué rico que sea muchas veces en Colombia.